Kia ora koutou and welcome to the first webinar of Creative New Zealand's Capability Building Programme for 2016-17. My name's Helen Bartle and I'm the Senior Advisor for Audience Development and Capability Building at Creative New Zealand, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's topic, Chairing the Board. Arguably one of the most important ingredients in the performance of a governing board, the chair's role is multifaceted and one that demands much of its practitioners. Today, Graeme Nahkies from BoardWorks International will explore the modern concept of the chair's role and how proactive board leadership assists boards to meet expectations of board effectiveness. As many of you will know, Graeme is the author of the Getting on Board manual, which is available to download from Creative New Zealand's website. Today's session will last for an hour and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions midway through and at the end of the session. And both the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentation will be made available via Creative New Zealand's website for reference after today's session. Finally, a note to let you know that attendance at these webinars can also be used as a credit for CPD continuing professional development if board members belong to the Institute of Directors or other professional bodies.
Okay, Helen, shall I proceed then?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, look, sorry about the technical problems, folks, and hopefully we won't let those interfere too much with this. What I'm going to do is explain explore a range of the factors in good chair effectiveness, and at some point, probably about halfway through, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to make. There's no particular structure to the way I'm handling this topic. I'm just going to work through a range of different effectiveness factors that I've found both in my consulting work and in my own role as chair, and also looking at some of the best practice writing that's emerging about chairing the board. This first quote I think is very important because if I've learned nothing else over the last 20 years or so working almost solely with boards, it is that the chair is possibly the most critical single ingredient in effective governance. There are plenty of other elements, of course, but the chair's role is absolutely vital. Next slide, please. This refers to the chair being the CGO, or Chief Governance Officer. And I think it's quite a nice way to think about the chair's role, and it certainly underlines the importance. It's sort of saying that the role of the chair is to lead and provide assurance of a process which is going to produce high-performance governance. Next slide, please, Helen. One of the most useful concepts that I've come across in thinking about the board's role is this idea of servant leadership. There are a number of different sources for that concept, but the one I'm particularly influenced by is a series of essays that were written back in the 1970s by an American called Robert Greenleaf. And that material is still around if anyone would like to try and find it, and I can help you if needs be. But he talked a lot about this idea of servant leadership in terms of board work generally, but particularly in terms of the role of the board chair. So there are a number of different dimensions referred to on this slide. One is about facilitating the development and performance of the board as a leadership group and serving that group by good leadership. Another factor which I think is really important, and it goes to the heart of good governance, is for the chair to protect the integrity of the board's own governance processes and the rules that it might, or protocols that it might adopt around those. We see some chairs that act as if they're the boss of the board, the boss of the organisation, the boss of the chief executive. None of that works particularly well. It's far more effective to think of the role of the chair being someone who is a first amongst equals. And flowing on from that is the idea of the chair being a coach rather than an instructor. So again, that's consistent with the idea of supporting good governance rather than determining it in an instructional sense. Another concept which I've included here is the idea of the chair being a statesman rather than a partisan. I think if we unpack that, it's very much about the chair being someone who can, in a diplomatic sort of way, I guess, bring together all the different components of the board, all the different members and their contributions, and to make the best use of those, rather than being a partisan in the sense of being a strong advocate for their own thinking and their own position on something. The final element here is about the idea of using influence rather than authority. There's a lot of authority residing in the chair's position within a board and within an organisation, but good chairs very, very rarely resort to that positional authority through their own actions, through their facilitation skills, through their knowledge of the board's work and the like. They can use their influence to guide the board to good outcomes. Next slide, please, Helen. I think a good starting point in terms of the CGO role is for the chair to set performance expectations for the board. This slide contains a few quotes, again from Graeme Nahkies, who I was referring to before. And I think that those each go to the heart of the sort of standards that a board sets for its own effectiveness, its own performance, its own value that it adds to organisational outcomes. And Greenleaf really underlines the importance of the board stepping up, and that to me relies a lot on the ability of the chair to set and keep the board accountable to those standards. That then brings into the sort of toolbox that a chair might have, things like effective board and board member performance evaluation. Those sorts of processes, and some of you will no doubt have experience in them, will not be value adding unless the chair is a solid supporter of the process. If a chair is lukewarm about board and director evaluation, you can be pretty certain that it's not going to work that well. Next slide, please, Helen. I referred to the chair as a facilitator before, and arguably the key job of the chair is to ensure that board meetings are productive and satisfying. And that's to some degree a matter of process management and style of the chair. But in respect of board meetings, an effective chair is not a dominant individual, not autocratic, and so it might be useful to use a metaphor like that of an orchestra conductor. So the chair, by that method or that perspective, is someone who, as an orchestra conductor would, allows all the parts of the team, of the board, to play at the right pace and volume and in some sort of balance with the timing of their participation being effective. So I think that's quite a nice sort of starting point to think about the chair's role, that of the conductor, and in that way being a true servant of the venture, which a board meeting is. That then in turn brings into our site the sort of processes that are vital for good board work. And some of these things we've covered in previous webinars. So the idea of the board conducting a dialogue rather than a debate, for example. For the mode of engagement around the board table being a process of inquiry rather than inquisition. And for the board to actually set out on the basis that it is in a learning process, not necessarily in a judging sort of a process. So we're saying that the chair as conductor assists discussion to come to a productive conclusion and ensures there is agreement and understanding of the decisions and the outcomes of the board's work. So the chair effectively manages the facilitation components of the role, but they also at the same time have to find a way of making a productive personal contribution to that dialogue and decision making while avoiding dominating proceedings. For example, an effective chair would usually avoid leading off a discussion along the lines of, I think we should. Now, as soon as the chair does that, they'll immediately force other board members to either agree or disagree with them, rather than putting their own unimpeded thoughts on the table. So the chair has an important task to open up the discussion and guide it, and ensure that everyone has had a chance to present their point of view. The chair himself or herself does have a very strong view on the proposed course of action. Then they might even hand the leadership of the discussion over to someone else. That might not happen that often, but it's certainly something that's worth considering at times. Helen, I can tell you that I've got the slides on screen now, so I might try and drive it myself, okay?
Yeah, great. Give it a go, but I'm here as backup if you need me.
Okay, let's try. Okay, that works, I think. So I think a chair has a very vital role in the way that they help the board decide how it's going to spend its time, which is arguably the board's most precious resource. And in terms of that, the chair has to ensure that the board has a focus on the right sort of things. You know, boards can be passive caretakers, or they can, and this is another term which was contained in one of those earlier Graeme Nahkies quotes, they can drive their organisations to distinction and superior performance. And that's certainly not a passive role. Assuming the latter course, that the board does and can drive their organisation, the chair has the responsibility to ensure that the board is focused on the right stuff. You know, despite their enthusiasm for greater engagement and setting strategic direction, too many boards become bogged down in business as usual. Business as usual exerts a very, very strong gravitational pull. So the chair must ensure that the board has an almost obsessive preoccupation with what their organisation must achieve and the changes it must make to get from where the organisation is today to where it needs to be. So if I can just explain the picture on the slide is it's of somebody creating fire by pushing the sun's rays through a magnifying glass. The magnifying glass concentrates those rays so that the energy is applied and flame can be created. I think it's a nice way to think about what the chair needs to do in terms of focusing the board's attention. Bringing all that energy together so that the right things get attention and the right things get thought through. The chair must therefore ensure that the board's very deliberate in how it allocates its time, and it's really important that chairs take direct personal responsibility for planning board agendas. And we've talked about this again at previous webinars, the idea of having an annual agenda or an annual work plan to create a sense of what the key discussion topics, the key decisions that must be made, the key policy decisions that must be addressed, that those things are on the board's work plan from day one, and that then successive board meetings gradually work through those. The second thing is the structure of the board meeting itself. We've talked about the inverted agenda, or the idea of turning the traditional board agenda on its head so that the most important things that the board has to do are dealt with first in the meeting while energy is high, attention is concentrated, and there is time available to get through important conversations. Another really important thing that a chair does is to help keep the board at the right elevation. The chair must, of course, understand the role of the board and appreciate its unique characteristics. I mentioned before the need to start from a strong sense of organisational purpose and the outcomes that must be achieved to support the fulfilment of that purpose. So keeping the board's attention at the right elevation, for example, keeping focused on the governing role of the board rather than allowing dialogue to wander into operational spheres unless there is a clear basis for the board's interest there. On the slide, I've included two completely separate views of the Tongariro River, which is where I like to spend as much of my time as I can. There's quite a contrast between the board being down at the sort of the level of the river, if you like, or even in it, as I often am, and being in the proverbial helicopter, where you can see the river in its context, you can see its length, you can see its surrounding environment. The board can keep a whole picture, a systems-wide view of the organisation and its operating environment if it stays at the right elevation. That doesn't mean to say that from time to time the chair shouldn't make sure that the helicopter lands and maybe take some tests of the water quality or its equivalent in the boardroom context. A really useful question that I found in chairing and being a member of boards when it looks like the elevation is at the wrong point is to simply ask the question, what is the governance relevance of this issue? People come to the table with all sorts of enthusiasms for things that they want to discuss, but frequently it's quite hard to avoid getting sidetracked unless the board keeps being brought back to what is really important here and what is relevant to our governance role. In terms of that starting point, it's important that the chair has a good understanding of and makes good use of the key governance documentation that the board has adopted in order to keep the board on track and to leverage its time and attention. Things like, for example, a board charter or job description or governance manual, those are the sorts of things that a chair needs to have a very good, close familiarity with and be able to remind the board and pull them back to those elements when it's appropriate. Another thing that a chair has to be very conscious of is the concept of proportionality or materiality. For example, I'm just working with a client at the moment where at a recent meeting the chair allowed one board member to distract the board by obsessing for 15 minutes on a missing bracket in the draft annual report. Now clearly there was no proportionality or materiality to that, and the chair should have simply said, let's take that lost line, and if anyone's got any observations about typos in the annual report, let's deal with it after the meeting. That sort of thing is what a chair needs to be conscious of all the time. Another challenge for the board chair is to try and make sure that the board acknowledges and makes the best use of the skills, the knowledge and the wisdom around the board table. If we back up the truck a wee bit, the chair influences, where possible, the composition of the board in the first place so that the board has the skills, the knowledge and the experience around the table that matches the needs of the board and the organisation. And in that sense, the chair should be right into an active succession planning process, even if the board itself cannot directly influence its composition. I think the board, under the chair's direction, needs to ensure that it has a clear idea of its strengths and weaknesses, and it can advise whoever is the appointing authority just what gaps need to be filled. Once the board is established, the chair values and understands and uses the strengths of those already around the table, and especially the differences between people. And part of the role of the chair in this context is making sure that minority views are not glossed over or even marginalised, because often it's that minority view that holds the essence to an important decision or a shift of focus of the board or some sort of new and instrumental understanding of the organisation and its challenges. The chair encourages participation and contribution by steering the conversation towards the quieter individuals, for example, if that needs to happen. The chair also, and this is an interesting concept, mines for conflict of ideas, I should emphasise, conflict of ideas, or in other words, divergence in the board's thinking, taking advantage of diversity but preventing that diversity from deteriorating as it can easily do into a conflict of personalities. Helen, I think that's probably a good point for us to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or comments.
Yep, that sounds good. So if anyone has a question or comment, then you can just raise the question in the chat box on the left-hand side. And if you don't, we'll just continue on. So it doesn't look like we have anything at this stage, Graeme. So I think possibly because we were a bit late starting as well, we should probably continue on unless anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Okay.
We do have one from Stephen
right.
Hodgkin, and he wants to know, how do we manage conflicts of personalities?
I wish we had all day. I think that it has a number of different dimensions there. I think a good starting point is for there to be some sort of agreement around the board table about desirable behaviours, and quite a few boards have adopted codes of conduct, for example, and that's given them the opportunity to explore the sort of behaviours that should be norms around the board table. In terms of meeting process, I think as soon as those sorts of personality conflicts start to appear, I think the chair needs to jump on those, not necessarily in an aggressive way, but again, a bit like my question before, what's the governance relevance of this? To try and probe for around the tension that's observed around those conflicts, to try and bring it back to what is the issue here that the board as a whole should be discussing. So those are two things that I would think about, but we could perhaps have a further discussion about that at the end of the webinar if we've still got time.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of other questions as well, Graeme. I don't know if you want to take these now or whether you want to address them at the end. So there's a question around inappropriate behaviour of a chair and also good process when it comes to involving other board members in succession decisions. So,
okay, look, let's take those now. So the chair's role, is the question really about when the chair is the behavioural problem himself or herself? If that is the case, that's very, very difficult for a board to deal with when the chair is the problem. Often there's somebody on the board who has the respect of the chair who can take them aside for a cup of coffee or something and just have a quiet chat about the implications of that kind of behaviour and how it's influencing or distracting the board. In extreme cases that I've been involved in, it's resulted in the chair actually being replaced, and that's perhaps a final step in the process. In terms of succession planning, can you just repeat the question there, please?
Yes, so the question is, for good process, how much do we involve other board members in succession decisions?
Okay, well, I was talking before about succession planning, but it's in the succession decisions. In other words, in terms of actual appointments to the board, ideally the whole board is involved in that process at some point in the process, if that's possible, particularly if the board has some sort of direct influence over who is joining the board. I think it would be a mistake to leave those sorts of decisions to a small group, although quite often an appointments panel or something like that is used to go through applications and to sort through different CVs and different applications to join the board. But I think at the end of the day that the board as a whole should be involved if at all possible.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks Graeme.
Okay, shall we move on then?
Yep, that sounds good.
So the reality is that boards over the course of, say, a year make relatively few really significant decisions. But it's important that even though those decisions might relate to some sort of unanticipated opportunities, it's still important that the board works through a systematic and principled approach that's consistent with organisational purpose, policies, priorities, and also with organisational performance capacity and capabilities. You know, sometimes boards are forced to make important decisions under quite a lot of time pressure. If that time pressure is unavoidable, the board ideally would have still the opportunity to stick to a pre-agreed process for making those sorts of decisions so that it didn't just get knee-jerked into a decision that it might later come to regret. So even though there is a bunch of decision-making criteria that sit either explicitly or implicitly in amongst key governance documents like strategic plans, policies and so forth, there's always a certain amount of flex in those. And here again, it's important for the chair to ensure that that flex, that flexibility perhaps does not take it into the realm of decisions that are not well thought through, even if there are time pressures. And even if the chair themselves are actually wedded to or have a strong preference for a particular approach to that decision. Another thing that's really important around decision-making processes is that the chair has an awareness of and acknowledges and steers around, if you like, the various potholes that are inherent in group decision-making. We've touched on these also in earlier webinars, but just to give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things I'm referring to when I'm talking about decision-making potholes. One, for example, is often referred to as the confirmation bias. That refers to our tendency to search for and favour information that confirms our beliefs while simultaneously ignoring or devaluing information that contradicts those beliefs. That confirmation bias is a key factor in what we often refer to as groupthink, which is where groups like boards make really dumb decisions even though they had information available that might have prevented that. Something else which is relevant in this context is sometimes called the planning fallacy. And that's the tendency to underestimate the time needed to complete tasks. And the planning fallacy is very relevant to board work because we tend to err on the side of optimism when we think about how long it's going to take us to work through an issue. The planning fallacy actually stems from another error, which is the one I just referred to effectively, the optimism bias it's called. And so those are the sorts of things that I would hope that as part of their own professional development, a chair would take some time to study and to be aware of, and if appropriate also take the board itself through some of those sorts of group decision-making challenges so that the board is more self-aware when it does come to making important decisions. I talked before in answer to a question about setting norms of behaviour. People come to the board table with different experiences and different expectations as to how the board should function. The important job the chair has is to flush out, align and, if appropriate, codify, as I said before, perhaps in a code of behaviour or something like that might sit inside a board charter. And, you know, I think we're pretty conscious of things like conflicts of interest and the need to be really clear as to how they should be managed. The example I've used on the slide to illustrate this is something which I'm finding is becoming more and more a topic for conversation among boards and certainly in the sort of workshops that I've been involved in the last year or so. And that's behaviour in regards to the use of smartphones and the like during board meetings. You know, a lot of boards are getting to be pretty much reliant on electronic board papers, and even if it isn't a matter of smartphones, people have their iPads out on the table, and it's very easy for individuals to get distracted from the content of the meeting. And I see lots of examples of what I simply call device addiction, where people can't seem to keep up a concentration on what's happening in the meeting for more than a few minutes at a time before they seem to be compulsively required to check emails or text messages or go online for some reason or other. It's interesting that this has even become now a focus of legal action. There's a court case in the UK a year or so ago where the appellants in this case, who were some aggrieved shareholders, sought discovery of people's internet provider records so that they could see whether or not the directors had their mind on the job at the time that they made the decision, which caused the pain for those shareholders. So it's just one example, though, of the sorts of behaviours that may not be consistent with board effectiveness. And it's the sort of thing that the chair should try and proactively bring the board's attention to and have the board agree on how those sorts of things are going to be managed so that the board can do its best work and can stay focused on the things that are really important while they're all together. Once those agreements have been reached, whether or not they've been codified, a very important job for the chair then is to make sure that any of those behaviours which are contrary to what has been agreed do not go unnoticed and unattended to. I suppose the heading on this slide is so obvious it almost doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. You cannot be an effective chair unless you're well prepared for meetings, unless you've not only been actively involved, as I mentioned before, in the design of the agenda and the structure of the meeting, but also in terms of being over the sorts of agenda items that are going to require the board's attention. To an important degree, the board meeting is the chair's meeting. If you're the chair, you're the one that has to guide the board through the agenda to achieve a productive outcome. Very hard to do that if you haven't shaped the meeting in the first place, and if you don't have a really clear understanding of what's going to be achieved or what is supposed to be achieved in relation to each of the matters that are coming before the board at that particular meeting. So to me, this is simply a matter of being in good shape to do your job. While you can't take responsibility for the degree of preparation of your colleagues, you can certainly, and in fact I'd say you must, set a good example yourself. And another factor here in terms of preparation is ensuring that the material for the board meeting is of a quality that enables your fellow board members to prepare efficiently and effectively. That might relate to the quality of the papers that are being prepared, also the timeliness of them. Does the board get them in sufficient time to properly study them and be prepared for the meeting? It's a form of quality assurance, and that underlines a number of the things that I've been talking about this morning, the chair's quality assurance role. Some boards, for example, insist on seeing board papers in draft before the board meeting pack is distributed. At the very least, the chair should ensure that the chief executive and her team have a very clear understanding of the kind of material that will support the board in its work. It's a bit like the Goldilocks thing, I think. Not too much, not too little, just right. And that's something that requires a continuous dialogue between the chair and the executives that are supporting the board in terms of preparation of agendas and papers. Can I just add that preparedness goes beyond board meetings as well for the chair? I see too many chairs who are what the Americans call overboarded. In other words, they're on so many boards that their attention is diluted and diffuse. They are not sufficiently focused on the matters in hand. In fact, At times I see chairs who hardly seem to know which meeting they're at. If the chair's not on the ball, it's hardly reasonable to expect other board members to be on top of their game either. Now, one of the things that I haven't acknowledged in any of the slides this morning is that to be a good chair, you also need the time to put into the job. Be cautious about taking on a chair's role if you don't think that you can do the sort of preparation that I'm thinking about, that I've been talking about. It just puts you under pressure, it will put the board under pressure, it will put the management team under pressure. So bear in mind that probably the amount of time a chair puts into their role is probably at least double the amount of time that other board members will need to put in. There's a lot of liaison work outside of the board meeting with staff, with stakeholders, as well as the sort of preparation that I've talked about. Part of being on the ball for the chair is to be connected into the challenges facing the organisation and to be in a position to stimulate the board's thinking. That's not something that should be left entirely to staff, but it should also probably be part of the chair's expectations of their other board members. But it means, for example, exploring various sources of published information that gives some insight into your organisation and its operating environment and the sorts of things that are going on in that operating environment that may have implications for you. Networking and relationship building, sort of flying the flag, I suppose, is also an important part of a chair's role. In respect of communicating with stakeholders, I think that chairs need to be very careful in communicating with stakeholders, that they do so in a sense in lockstep with the chief executive and other key senior staff. That's so that they avoid cutting across, for example, negotiations that might be underway or conveying messages that are not as well aligned as they should be. Our last webinar, and some of you may have been on that webinar, will remember that we talked specifically about the relationship between the board chair and the chief executive. I'm at the risk of repeating some of that now, but let me just say that it is a vital relationship. The chief executive and the chair are the 2 points that connect the governance team up with the operational team. I've always liked the sort of concept that the chair and the chief executive need to be like dance partners, for example. Different steps, but in time to the same music. In this particular picture, I'm not sure which is the chair and which is the chief executive. My friend, the late William Whittaker, who was formerly the chief executive of the Institute of Directors, was fond of saying that Ginger Rogers had to do pretty much everything that Fred Astaire did, but she was going backwards in high heels. I'm not sure whether that applies more to the chief executive or the chair's role. I think it can in some ways apply to both at different times. But looking at it solely from the chair's perspective, there's a very important role to be played in his or her direct relationship with the chief executive. Too many boards take the relationship and the satisfactory performance of the chief executive for granted. They don't recognise, for example, that the board and the chair probably in particular also have a very important motivational role for the chief executive. Chairs frequently have to remind their boards, for example, when boards, as they sometimes do, get into some form of sort of nitpicking, inquisitional sort of mode, perhaps other undesirable modes of behaviour as well, the chair has to remind the board that the board has a vested interest in the chief executive being successful in the role, and the chair needs to be alert to board behaviours that actually undermine that confidence and cut across the chief executive and his or her motivation, and supporting them in their role, which can be quite a lonely one. One of the things that's really important for the chair to have a mind to in respect of the relationship between the board and the chief executive is that the board speaks to the chief executive with one voice. Now, until a board has made a decision, there are potentially as many voices as there are people around the table. And that's one of the key roles for the chair, is to bring those disparate voices together to make a decision, if that's appropriate, that lets the chief executive walk out of the meeting with a very clear sense of what they have to do, what the objectives are, what the limitations that might be imposed are in terms of risk management and the like. But if the chair doesn't ensure that decisions are nailed down, the chief executive can easily leave a board meeting having to make their own judgment about what's the next step without having had suitable guidance from the board, but perhaps having the loudest or the most aggressive or the most demanding board members' voice ringing in their ear and feeling obliged to respond to that particular strength of advocacy. Another thing in relation to this that the chair must do is see that the board fulfills its obligation to be a good employer. It continues to surprise me how many boards neglect even the basic dimensions of this obligation, such as regular performance review and feedback. If the board's not acting as a good employer, that is inevitably on the chair's head. So it's something that I think chairs need to pay particular attention to. But in doing so, it's important that they don't become, in effect, the de facto supervisor of the chief executive. The chief executive works for the board as a whole, and the processes that the board adopts should reinforce that. So, for example, I see too many situations where boards basically delegate to the chair the whole of that chief executive performance management process. In my view, that process should be led by somebody else other than the chair. We can perhaps unpack that at the end of the webinar if people would like to pursue that a little bit further. The basic reason for me saying that is simply that the day-to-day working relationship between the board and the chair can easily be disrupted when the chair has to, in effect, change hats and become the person who determines, in effect, the future of the chief executive's continuation in her role. Here's another metaphor which is also quite a useful way of thinking about this relationship. The idea that the chair and the chief executive are doubles partners. And I guess that the thing that draws out is that the chair and the chief executive need to be an effective team, but utilising their respective strengths and perspectives so that you can get the best out of both people in terms of assisting the organisation to succeed, and succeed both in terms of its internal dynamics and its external relationships. The chair and the chief executive need to communicate actively about their mutual expectations. For example, to be clear about who is the face of the organisation in relationship to particular matters. I remember very clearly to this day, even though it was probably 25 years ago now, even longer, when I arrived at my first day at work as a newly minted chief executive, my first chief executive role. My new chairman picked me up from the airport. While I'd been waiting for him, I'd had a quick glance at the front page of the newspaper. The organisation I was going to head was on the front page in conflict with one of its key stakeholders. And I said to the chairman, well, obviously one of the things we have to figure out really quick is who's going to be the person that appears on the front page dealing with these sorts of issues. And he said to me, Graeme, look, it's really simple. Good news me, bad news you. And I think I had a pretty clear idea from that point on how I should approach some of those sorts of issues. The role of the chief executive, as I alluded to before, is often a lonely one. One of the things that chief executives look for in particular is the opportunity for free and easy communication with their chair. The chief executive is often looking to utilise the perspective that the chair has and the wisdom that hopefully the chair has accumulated over their working life. The chair therefore has an obligation to be accessible. That accessibility might simply be at the end of a telephone if the chair and the chief executive aren't resident in the same city, but ideally it's the situation that a chief executive, they won't ring the chair without good reason usually, and it's really important that a chair can be responsive, even if it's just to be for a few minutes a sounding board about something. I guess that brings us to the topic of the chair and communication. But just, can I say, underline the first three words on the slide, the chair models. The chair models almost everything that goes on or you would like to go on in and around a board. But in this case, I'm picking specifically on effective communication because the chair has so much influence over setting the tone in the board. In terms of how the chair chooses to respond to difficult situations, for example, like the question before in relation to conflict, if the chair enters into that conflict directly themselves, it's not setting a good example. The chair needs to be able to sit back, keep everyone calm, keep everyone on track, on task. It's very easy because of the positional authority of the chair and the role they have in leading a board meeting for them to hog the airtime of the board meeting. I've seen chairs that operate on the basis that they feel compelled anytime anyone asks a question or makes a comment that they have to then speak and offer their point of view. I think that's very ineffective, and board meeting time is precious, as I remarked before. Try and ensure that everyone has the chance during the course of the meeting to say what's on their mind. The best boards tend to operate on a consensus basis rather than being the kind of boards that take a vote on everything. That's nothing wrong with a board taking a vote from time to time, but really the idea would be for a board meeting to finish with everyone shoulder to shoulder facing in the same direction with a commitment to whatever decisions have been made, even though it may not have, what was decided may not have been their first preference. Another thing that's really important is how you deal with your fellow board members. There will be some of them that will be much easier to work with than others. You've got to consciously work hard to ensure that you're even-handed in your dealings with all of them, that you don't favour one or more over others, because those cliques that can arise from that sort of behaviour can very quickly destroy a dynamic. One chair I'm working with at the moment is very bright, but also very introverted. Tends to rely on communication via emails. You know, for a lot of the time that's probably okay, but emails, as I think we've probably all learned, are hopeless for conveying important, difficult and nuanced communications. So be prepared to put the time into communicating directly on a face-to-face basis so far as possible with your fellow board members and with the senior executives that are critical to the organisation's performance. Stakeholder relationship building, I touched on that already, so I won't labour the point, but just to acknowledge that the part-time nature of the board's chair role means that this is even more demanding for the chair than perhaps for other members of the board whose time is not occupied with other things to do with board performance. So the chair can be quite constrained in the extent to which they can be actively involved in communicating and building relationships with stakeholders. However, at times it's really important for the chair to front up to particular gatherings of stakeholders or to be at particular meetings, perhaps to support the executive team. And don't ever underestimate the status of being the board leader. Sometimes people just want to see that you're actively engaged and taking an interest in a particular issue. And in that case, there can be quite a lot of use in having an explicit communications strategy that the board adopts, which enables the board to explore just what is expected of the chair in those regards. And finally, for the day, I also want to just observe that the chair has a really important role in closing the loop, and that's the performance loop, ensuring that the board is active and effective in monitoring organisational performance. A lot of time can go into the front end of planning and policy making end of things, but implementation of plans is often the weak point of many executive teams as well as boards, and so it's really important for the chair to be taking a very active interest in ensuring that the board is monitoring implementation of those plans and compliance with those policies. I've referred on the slide to typical shortcomings. One for a board is over-reliance on historical information. You know, financial results are a classic example of that. We get financial results a long time after it's possible to do anything to influence them. They are what are often in the jargon called lag measures. In other words, we get the information after the event actions have occurred, and they really describe the end result rather than the things that might have influenced that end result. So one of the things that a board chair needs to think carefully about is whether the board is actually working on the right kind of performance measures. I would urge you to think about measures which are called, again in the jargon, lead measures. They're the sorts of things that the organisation has some control over, and also if those measures are at the right level, then they will be good predictors of that lag result. So an example might be that for a theatre company, for example, sums on seats and financial results, those are the lag measures. The lead measures might relate to programming and performance, for example. Sometimes it's difficult to tell which are lag and which are lead measures, but it's about having that future focus, looking at the things that can be influenced on a real-time basis that will predict and achieve desirable lag results. I should also add that executive reporting to boards is frequently quite random rather than being specifically linked to strategic plan components and other forms of board set policy criteria. I think this is where sometimes chairs need to sit down with executive teams and work through to ensure that executive reporting is not just the usual statements of what the management team has been doing, but actually is focused on the results in relation to things that the board has already said are important, whether they're organisational results to be achieved or risks to be managed, policies to be complied with, just to make sure that what is reported to the board is what I call criterion reference rather than random and too frequently activity-based, which tells the board little more than whether the management team is busy. So just to conclude, can I just remind you of some resources that are available that you'll hopefully find useful. Getting on board, of course, is the foundation document for these webinars. If you want to explore the sorts of things I've been referring to. There are a lot of resources on our own website. That's BoardWorksInternational.com. And you can also sign up there for what has been recently irregular, but hopefully regular series of publications on topics like this. And also, can I just acknowledge a document that's published by Sport New Zealand, specifically on the role of the chair. And my colleagues and I had some input to that. It's a really nice, concise sort of document that will elaborate on a number of the things that we talked about this morning, and also a number of things that we haven't.
Thanks very much, Graeme. That previous document you just referred to, the role of the chair, did I see that was a Sports New Zealand published document?
And I'm pretty sure it can be downloaded off their website.
Okay, fantastic. Well, what we might do is try and find the link for that and then send it around to everyone that's on the webinar today. So I just want to say we're at time, but if anyone does have a question or a comment for Graeme, please feel free to let us know now. I also want to take this opportunity to apologise for the difficulties today, and also to you, Graeme, for the challenges, but that's not to take away from how valuable your insights have been. It's been a really great session, so thank you. If anyone has a question for Graeme after the webinar, then feel free to let us know, to email Grace, Sinclair or myself, and we can forward that on. And I'd just like to thank you all for your participation, and to let you know that the next Getting on Board webinar, you're going to have to wait a whole 6 months or so. That will be on the 14th of March 2017, and the topic will be Governance with Impact. But before then, we do have our very first Health and Safety webinar in a few weeks' time on the 22nd of November, and we'll send you an invite with further details for that one. So do take a couple of minutes to let us know what you thought of the session today in terms of content, and also it's really useful for us in terms of measuring the impact of these sessions. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. And thanks again, Graeme. Bye for now. Oh, we also have, great, fantastic. Stephen has, thank you very much, Stephen, for sending that link. That's really fantastic. Thank you. And we'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Bye for now. Ka kite.